right. Hello and welcome to the Georgian Fayee Center for Healthcare Innovations 2022-23 Patient Engagement Lunchtime Learning Series. This session is on navigating conflict in patient engagement using strengths-based approaches. I'll just start us off with a few housekeeping items. We do have time for discussion at the end, but feel free to ask questions or comment in the chat at any time. To use the chat box, click the chat button at the bottom of your screen and enter your text where it says type message here. You can send messages to everyone in the meeting or to specific people, such as myself, using the drop-down box above where you type your message. If you have any trouble with Zoom, please feel free to message me directly at any time. We do have captions enabled, so you should see closed captioning for the session. If you want to toggle this on or off, you can do so using the subtitles, or it might be caption button now at the bottom of your screen. This series is accredited by the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada as a group learning activity, and it's also eligible for credits towards requirements of other professional bodies, such as the College of Pharmacists of Manitoba and the College of Registered Nurses of Manitoba. If you'd like to receive credit for your attendance and a certificate, make sure your full name is shown. You can rename yourself by right-clicking on where your video is or where it would be and selecting rename. Or you can click the participants button at the bottom of your screen, find your name, hover over it and select more, and there you'll also have the option to rename yourself. We will be sharing a link to the recording and the slides with everyone who registered, as well as an invitation to the next session. I think that covers all my housekeeping items, so I'll now turn it over to Ogai.
Thank you, Trish. Hi and welcome, everyone. I would like to open our session today with a land acknowledgement. So the Center for Healthcare Innovations offices are located at the University of Manitoba Bannatyne campus on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We acknowledge the Northern Manitoba includes lands that were and are the ancestral lands of the Inuit. Our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nations. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and present, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I will continue to be a student so I can continue to learn and expand my knowledge around Indigenous culture, the history of present-day colonialism, ways to decolonize in my personal and professional life, and actively challenge my position as a first-generation immigrant settler and my beliefs through practicing self-awareness and reflexivity. So I think we're gonna start off with mindfulness breathing. Again, we truly appreciate you joining us today. Thank you for your gift of time. And we want this session to be interactive, like Trish had mentioned prior. So please don't hesitate to send us questions, comments, or resources that you might have and that you would like to share with folks in this group. So please do so in the chat. So we're going to take a few minutes to do a breathing exercise as a way to ground us. Conflict can bring about stressful feelings, and breathing can help us remain calm in such moments and situations. So we can be proactive and engage in a way that leads to learning and growth. So moving forward, you can apply this to your personal, but also your professional life as well. So if you feel comfortable, you can turn your camera off, or you can keep your camera on, whatever makes you feel most comfortable. So find a position that you're comfortable with, and we will begin by shifting our focus on our breathing. So although it might sound easy, it can be tricky. So I want everyone to inhale. Take a deep breath and hold it for 1, 2, 3, and exhale 1, 2, 3. Again, take a deep breath in, inhale, hold it for 1, 2, 3, and exhale. And as you're doing this breathing exercise, you will notice your thoughts might wander, and that's okay. We just gently bring our focus back to our breathing. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, and exhale, 1, 2, 3. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, and exhale. 1, 2, 3. And now I would like to invite everyone back. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully, this is something you're able to incorporate moving forward when you need to take a pause. So without further ado, we're going to talk about conflict. So what is conflict? Conflict is universal, meaning it occurs across cultures, genders, and age groups. And conflict is part of any healthy relationship. We all have different perspectives and view of the world and situations through our own lens. So as a result, people or groups might disagree, and therefore it can rise from differences both large or small. And conflict can occur when folks have disagreements over their values, motivation, ideas, and desires. And although at times these differences may appear trivial, but when conflict triggers strong feelings, a deep personal need is often at the core of the problem. So it's crucial that we deal with conflict as opposed to avoiding it. And when conflict is mismanaged, it can have negative impacts on our relationship or relationships. However, when we take proactive measures by handling the situation or even in a respectful way, conflict provides an opportunity to strengthen the bond between two people or groups. And our hopes for today's session are to share insights and examples so you can continue to build and expand on your skills to keep your personal and professional relationships strong and growing. And so going on to the next slide, we're going to take a look at strength-based approaches. And conflict and conflict resolution are topics that are well researched across different disciplines using different theoretical frameworks. And today we will be using strength-based approaches when examining conflict in patient-public engagement. Strength-based approaches or framework was formally developed by a team from University of Kansas, Dennis Selby, Charles Repp, and Ann Beck, and its foundation is in social work. And strength-based approaches focuses on transformation, self-determination, empowerment, and professional ethics rather than problem-solving alone. And strength-based approaches takes into consideration people's interests, their needs, and identity, but also focuses on competence, assets, membership, abilities, knowledge, and capacities as opposed to deficits. It also looks at conflict as a collaborative process. So when conflict does arise, problems are viewed as opportunities for growth and change. While conflict problems in the person situation interactions are the basis for initial engagement between, let's say, two patient partners or patient partner and a researcher, developing and implementing solutions calls upon our strengths and also the strengths and resources in our environment. So strength-based approaches helps us to reframe our focus away from problems and turn our focus to examine our options and alternatives and design strategies to support and strengthen relationships and healthy ways to overcome conflict. And so on the next slide, we'll look at needs and motivations. As human beings, we all need to feel a sense of connection, belonging. We need to feel understood, nurtured, and supported. But the ways in which these needs are met can vary quite widely. So we all have different needs for feeling comfortable and safe, which can create some challenges in our personal and professional relationships. So think about conflicting needs for safety and continuity versus the need to explore and take risks. For example, we frequently see conflict between a toddler and a parent. So the child's need and motivation is to explore without boundaries, but the parent's needs and motivation is to protect the child's safety. So really limiting the exploration, which then can create contention between the two of them. A more relevant example might be conflict between a researcher and a patient partner. So the patient partner's need might be to spend a few meetings, building relationships, where the researcher's need and motivation might be to meet the project deadline. So again, this can create tension between the two of them. So the needs of both parties play an important role in the long-term success of most relationships. and each deserves respect and consideration. So in personal relationship, a lack of understanding about differing needs can result in distance, arguments, and breakups. In professional capacity, differing needs are often at the heart of disagreements, sometimes resulting in communication breakdown, disruption to the work, and/or abrupt end to the relationship. So when we can recognize the legitimacy of conflicting needs and become willing to examine them in an environment of compassionate understanding, it opens pathways to creative problem solving, team building, and improved relationships. And so looking at the next slide, how conflict is perceived based on our own perceptions. So I would like everyone to take a few seconds to reflect. How do you perceive conflict? How do you approach conflict? And what are some feelings underlying your experiences with conflict? So again, keep these questions in mind as we're going through this presentation, and afterwards, Trish will share the slides, so you'll have these questions to kind of reflect back on as you're examining conflict and what that means for you in your relationships. But also I want you to think about, do you fear conflict or avoid it at all costs? Do you agree with others, persons to avoid conflict? So if your perception of conflict comes from frightening or painful memories from previous relationships or early childhood, you may expect all present day disagreements to end badly. So you may view conflict in relationships as demoralizing, humiliating, even dangerous, and sometimes something to fear. So if your early experiences also left you feeling out of control and powerless, conflict may even bring up past or present trauma. So when we view conflict as unsafe, it tends to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we go into conflict situations already feeling extremely threatened. So it's tough to deal with the problem at hand in a healthy way. Instead, we are more likely to shut down and display anger. And so looking at the next slide, conflict can trigger strong emotions and lead to feelings of stress and discomfort. And first off, it's important that we are kind and not judgmental with ourselves. Second, self-awareness is key. So we are better able to understand our own needs and best ways to communicate them with others, and being able to focus on what really is bothering us. And although in our society, conflict is often viewed as negative, and folks try to avoid it as much as possible, I want to remind everyone that when we prepare and are proactive, we are better equipped to resolve conflict in a healthy way. And resolving conflict increases our understanding of one another, builds trust, and strengthens our relationship bond. So we'll take a look at nonverbal communication next. So there are several studies that show nonverbal communication is honestly 70 to 90% of our communication, which is nonverbal. So our body language, nonverbal cues are the way how we convey and exchange information with one another. So the most important, I think our lights went off in the room. I'm just gonna excuse myself for 1 second while I turn it. Oh, there it is. Sorry about that. So what I was kind of referring earlier was that the most important information exchanged during conflict is non-verbally, which is conveyed by emotionally driven facial expressions. And oftentimes we make facial expressions without even being aware that we're making them. And facial expressions are basically how we show happiness, surprise, sadness, anger, and all of this is universal across cultures. But also taking a look at posture or gesture, body movement, touch, pace, tone of our voice, and intensity of our voice. And so looking at the next slide, when folks are upset, the words we use rarely convey the issue and needs at the heart of the problem. So when we stop and truly listen for what is felt as well as what is said, we are able to connect more deeply to our own needs and emotions and those of others. And active listening In this way, strengthens us, informs us, and makes it easier for others to hear us. So let's imagine for a moment that we are in the middle of a conflict. If we slow down and pay attention to the other person's nonverbal signals, it will help us to begin to figure out what the other person might be saying. This will allow us to respond in a way that builds trust by separating the person from the behavior and getting to the root of the problem. A calm, empathetic tone of voice, a reassuring touch, again, if it's appropriate in the context and with the individual, or even an interested and concerning facial expression can go a long way to relaxing a tense exchange. So our ability to accurately pick up nonverbal signals and cues is dependent on our own emotional awareness. The more self-aware we are of our emotions, the easier it is to pick up on the nonverbal communication that reveals the other person's feelings and needs. So I'm going to share some tips in terms of active listening. So we listen to the reasons the other person gives for being upset. Paraphrase. So making sure we understand what the other person is telling us from his, her, or their perspective. Ensuring that we are hearing what the other person is saying. And then on the other slide, it's important that we summarize at the end and ask if we have understood correctly. Ask if anything remains unspoken, given the person time to process before answering. And this is really important, that we resist the temptation to interject our own point of view until the other person has said everything they want to say and feels that we have listened to and understood their message. So we're basically listening to understand, not listening to respond. And on the other slide, here are a few helpful examples of responses when listening to the other person's perspective. Please help me understand what has upset you. I'm interested to know what your hopes are. And then on the next slide, it's important that we never make assumptions. So we need to clarify what the real problem or need might be, and letting the other person know that we care and we want to understand. For example, can you say more about that? Is that the way it usually happens? Have you resolved this in the past? So again, breaking question number 3 down a little bit, when we help people to think about a problem that they have resolved, we're inviting them to look at the skill sets that they already have. So it's really more of a solution-focused, strength-based approach. So we can think of formulating our questions in a way that draws on folks' skills and assets. And so it's important to restate what you have heard, so you're both able to see what has been understood so far. And it might be that the other person will then realize that additional information is needed. Again, some examples might be, it sounds like you weren't expecting that to happen. Reflecting feelings, so being as clear as possible. And I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you. Again, we want to say I can't imagine because we can never fully put ourselves in the shoes of another person by saying I've been there and I know what it feels like, because we don't. So it's good to just let the other person know that you can't imagine, and maybe they'll expand on that. So even if the solution is vague at the beginning, it's important to validate the concerns of the other person. Expressing appreciation can be a very powerful message if it's conveyed with integrity and respect. So I truly appreciate that we are talking about this. I'm glad that together we're able to figure this out. And then lastly, the importance of using I statements in a conflict can be quite powerful, as it de-escalates the situation and takes the blame, judgment, and criticism away. And therefore, the listener is less defensive. In other words, an I statement helps the individual share their feelings and needs in a way that is easy for the other person to hear and understand. So for example, I feel concerned when not everyone in the group is getting a chance to share their voice and perspective. Let's work together to find a solution. So I would like to now turn your attention to my wonderful colleague and our patient engagement lead, Carolyn Shimon, who's going to take you a step further by providing you with tools that you can incorporate to best prepare for conflict in your patient engagement activities. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Oga. I always learn so much from you. And I was writing down lots to think about. Listening to understand, not to respond. Such an important tip. So now I'm going to just lead us into setting the stage to address conflict should it arise. So things that you might be able to do ahead of time to make sure that should conflict arise, that you feel a little bit more prepared and that there's a few tools and resources available to address it. So first of all, I think it's important just to go back to some of the principles of patient engagement and teamwork, because that really emphasizes, once again, the relationship aspect. So when we think about principles of engagements, we think about prioritizing relationships. And this can be a different way of doing research, right? We typically prioritize research than the relationships. But I would say in patient engagement, patient-oriented research, we're really putting the building of the relationship and the sustaining of the relationship ahead of everything else, because we want to be able to share decision-making power and work together as a team. So sharing power, using participatory means, so finding ways to meet people where they're at so that everyone in the group can contribute. Those are really important bits. And then building capability, and that's things like building awareness around these relationship aspects. And again, some other important aspects that we sometimes talk about is making decisions together, that all types of knowledge are equally valued, that we're appreciating resiliency, creativity, and capability. So really appreciating every member around the table and what they bring to the table, and understanding, even if you are doing a research project that's looking at maybe a problem, that you understand the resiliency that it takes to live with a health issue. And so really respecting that aspect. Then recognizing an abundance of experience and ideas and all the energy around the table for change. Thinking about always having opportunities to collaborate at every level of decision making. And then also at times we got to slow it down, and we have to listen and connect and learn. And so some things that we've learned over time is that when we do engagement, sometimes we take the first couple of meetings of the team and just do relationship building activities and bringing and coming together and building that aspect before we even start diving into research decision making. So making space for that as well. And this is reflected back in what we heard with the Valuing All Voices framework, which is a patient engagement framework around incorporating a trauma-informed intersectional analysis. Maybe if we go to the next slide. And so if you see, when we talk to people with lived experience and community members, that a lot of what people were saying is understanding and acceptance, trust, relationship building, self-awareness, education and communication. These were the important aspects of patient engagement, patient-oriented research. And these are the things that really need to be prioritized and looked at, and the skills built up around these things. So when we talk about self-awareness, one of the aspects that you may hear at times is critical reflexive practice. What does that mean? So at the individual level, all of us, when we come together as a team, there's a little bit of work that we have to do, whether we're a researcher or whether we're a patient partner, whether we're a healthcare professional, healthcare decision maker. There's tools that we can use to start thinking and reflecting upon our own our own perspectives and beliefs and values around the health research project that we're doing. So one of these tools is our Readiness to Engage workbook, and it's a neat little workbook that's on our website, and it has a fillable PDF, so you can either do it online or you can print it out and you can write in the boxes. And it has questions for both the individual and for the team to go through. And so some of the individual level questions that you can work through and think about include, and this is just an example, so thinking about reflecting on what are my own personal values and experiences and interests and beliefs and political commitments in the area of health we will be looking at or researching. So this is really moving us away from sometimes when we have the researcher hat on, we believe that we are objective and that we come to this health research issue completely objectively. And this is pushing us to really start reflecting how our own personal values and how these different things affect the way that we're even looking at the health issue and the way that we're proposing to do research or the way that we are engaging with people with lived experience, and really taking the time to reflect about that. And then taking it a little step deeper and thinking about how these personal experiences relate to the social locations we inhabit. And so that what that means is just each of us inhabit many, many different social locations. And when I say social locations, that just means socially constructed categories. So if we think about gender identity, gender expression, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, age, all of these different things, we're located in all these different aspects. And then it's linked to larger systems of power and oppression. So when we think about within the healthcare system, systemic racism, colonialism, transphobia, ableism, and that connection means that we inhabit different social locations that are either attached to unearned advantages or unearned disadvantages. And that affects the way we view things and our perception and our values and the way that we approach things. And so being cognizant of that and continuously reflecting upon that, taking a step back and doing ongoing critical reflexive practice. So even when you're doing engagement, having every member do a little journaling and reflecting on it on a regular basis is really important to think about. And then as a team, you can start having some of these discussions too. And that booklet has some good questions for teams. So thinking about how we can become more aware as a group of opportunities where we can challenge each other's ideas and renegotiate power within our project team. Thinking about what Ogai was talking about, the importance of resiliency and strength and what that looks like and feels like and sounds like to us as a team and as members of a team. Then having conversations about how we can make sure that everyone's perspectives are included, that we're addressing inequities, and that as well as issues of social justice when we're doing the work we're doing. And this leads into something else that we refer to as trauma-informed engagement. And we've had some sessions on this before, and you perhaps have seen some of our sessions on this before. But really, one of the ways that we can set the stage and kind of create spaces where, should a conflict arise, that we feel better prepared to address it, is also thinking about your engagement strategy from a trauma-informed perspective. And so that means, is one of the group questions always is, in what ways do you think we can together make sure everyone on the team, as well as the people involved in the project, feel safe? And just a recap, trauma-informed just means that everyone really is building their awareness of the impact of trauma. That's a common experience, that sometimes when we share stories, they may be intertwined with with experiences of trauma, understanding that we use a wide range of adaptations in order to cope with and survive trauma, and that there are some relationships between trauma and substance use and mental health as well. And so some of the key elements when we're talking about trauma-informed engagement, again, is the prioritization around resiliency, really thinking about bearing witness and the importance of taking space and time to uphold people's stories and allow people to share their stories in a non-judgmental way. Giving back strengths-based affirmations when people do take the time to share their experiences. Again, the critical reflexive practice point. Always having choice in everything we do when we are engaging, because choice is a really important aspect, especially if perhaps people's lived experiences of a health issue has left them feeling very powerlessness or very powerless. Then incorporating choice in your collaboration is really important. And then building continuously safety and trustworthiness. And as Ogai mentioned, that means addressing conflict sometimes, right? And then empathy and boundaries, setting boundaries around respect with one another. And then, of course, self-care and self-compassion are integral aspects as well. And one of the activities we do around with groups a lot of times, whether you're a research team with people with lived experience all together, with researchers and healthcare professionals, whether you're a patient advisory group, one of the things we do in some of our initial meetings is have conversations around safe spaces. Some people refer it to safe spaces or brave spaces, and some people say that there is no such thing as safe spaces, and that has to be acknowledged as well. But what this does is, by having a conversation, what does physical safety mean to you? So even having that conversation around, ideally, what does it mean to you? What would it look like to you? What would it feel like to you? What does emotional, psychological safety mean to you, look like to you, feel like to you? Then also, what does cultural safety mean to you, look like to you, feel like to you? And what does spiritual safety mean to you, look like to you, and feel like to you? So in having those conversations, typically groups come up with different responses every time because it's defined differently and people see it differently, and what it looks like and feels like and means to them can be different. But at the end, you can create a guiding principles document, kind of a living document for your group, where you can write down all of that different input, and then review it on a regular basis. And what it does is kind of creates a common language to address when things arise, right? When a power imbalance arises, when there's conflict, we can say, hey, whether you're a researcher, whether you're a patient partner, or anyone in the group can kind of say, hey, can we look at those guiding principles? And that signals to us that we need to take some time to address something, right? And so it gives us kind of a way to signal to one another when we feel like things aren't going the way we want, or that some of our values or our expectations have not been met. One of the questions I sometimes get around conflict revolves around what we say calling out versus calling in. And this means when someone says something that is harmful. And so one of the ways in which you can start to kind of lay the foundation is when we have those safety conversations, we also talk about the difference between safety and comfort. And that includes that if you say something that's harmful, so for example, if you say something that's racist or sexist or homophobic or transphobic, ableist, xenophobic, all of those different things, that we're going to challenge one another, and that we're going to call one another out or call one another in. And it can be uncomfortable, but not for the person being called out, it's not unsafe, but it's an uncomfortable and it's going to be a tough conversation, but kind of laying out that ground. And there's a great resource by the Harvard Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging group around the difference between calling in and calling out. That is wonderful. And so they define calling out as bringing public attention to an individual, group, or organization's harmful words or behavior. And then calling in is an invitation to, say, a one-on-one or small group conversation to bring attention to an individual group's harmful words or behavior. And so when we say that, we mean bias, prejudice, microaggressions, or discrimination. And the reason calling in or calling out occurs is because we want to stop the perpetuation and negative effects of harmful words or behavior. We want to model and create a compassionate space for everyone. And we want to lean into having tough discussions, which is part of relationship building in general, right? And some of the considerations, sometimes when you start having to make the choice between calling out or calling in, certain things around influence. If you work in patient engagement and you're facilitating, then you do have the ability to call out on the spot. Safety, so recognizing that it might mean needing a one-on-one conversation versus out in, like having those kind of figuring out whether that openness, hopefully when you are growing your relationship and growing that trust, that there is an openness amongst all your members to having that conversation, and knowing openness means really you're going to move towards calling in, because that means you want to continue the relationship and you want to build and grow that relationship. So it'll be a calling in part. And then urgency as well. So if something has to be called out right away in order to address harm, that's really important. And so you might call out at first and then take a second step back and do some calling in later on. So these were examples from that Harvard group, and I think it's great because people actually will ask sometimes, like, well, what do I say when somebody says something? And I've been put on the spot too, where I'm like, okay, what do you say? So some of the ways that people might address, so calling out, this is where something happens and you got to address it right away. So thinking, that's not our culture here, that's not our values. You can even say, hey, that's not our guiding principles, to make that reference back to kind of what the group had decided on. You can say, it sounded like you said this. Is that what you really meant? This one I actually use a fair amount. I need to push back against that. I disagree. I don't see it that way. I need to know how that I need you to know how that comment just landed with me. It sounds like you're making some assumptions that we need to unpack a bit. Whereas calling in means that we're going to dedicate some time to having a longer conversation, whether it's one-on-one or whether it's as a group together or as a small group together. And that really means you can address it in this kind of way. So I'm curious, what was your intention when you said that? How might the impact of your words or actions differ from your intent? How might someone else see this differently? Is it possible that someone else might misinterpret your words or actions? And why do you think that is the case? Why do you believe that to be true? Some of the biggest tips is criticizing the behavior and not the person. So if someone says something that is sexist, not going, hey, you're sexist, but saying, hey, what you just said, and you can repeat what you just said specifically was sexist. Being specific, so pointing out what exactly it was. trying not to condescend. Now, this doesn't mean tone policing, because sometimes you'll be upset and you'll call out, and it's okay too, right? But as much as possible, trying not to keep the integrity and respect that the whole group has decided on. Then deciding whether it's appropriate to kind of call out right away or call in. And then we always say, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. So if we lay down some of those initial conversations at the beginning that we talked about around safe spaces and around expectations around our role and how we might want to address conflict, or ways that we want to recognize that, then hopefully everything will go well. But sometimes there are times where things don't work out and maybe someone leaves or no longer wants to engage. But the reality is, you've modeled the behavior, that the principles and the guiding principles that you've come up with as a group, right? And making sure that no harm comes. When you are called out, so there may be a time where any one of us can be called out. And so some of the tips are typically to take a pause, to take a deep breath. When you think about Olga at the beginning, when she talked about the breathing, so really grounding yourself to be present, because next you're going to want to listen, and you're going to want to listen to the explanation to why you harm, or to listen to what it is that you said or did that was harmful. Then you want to acknowledge, and this one can sometimes happen where you want to say, well, that wasn't my intent, or you want to defend, but you have to acknowledge it caused harm. So something I said or something I did caused harm. I'm truly sorry. Then it's on you to go away and reflect. It's not on other people to educate you or to emotionally look after you. It's for you to take the information away and to reflect on it, and then to educate yourself, maybe learn some more about the area in which you were talking about, and find more resources, and think about going to webinars and learning more. And then the way to repair the harm that's been done is by having those crucial those really important conversations with the group, and then not repeating it again, right? Really taking that to heart and learning ways to repair the harm that's been done. And then finally, as Ogai mentioned, it's so important. Self-care for all of us. We're all human, and we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to do things or say things, and there are going to be times when conflict arises. And it's really important to be gentle with yourself and exhibit patience for others, but also patience for yourself, that we're all kind of learning and on a process, and that never ends. We continue to learn. So having debriefing plans. So if a conflict arises within your team or within your group, having a plan afterwards. So whether it's touching base one-on-one with individuals who may have had a conflict, just to make sure that they feel like it's been resolved, that things have been looked at, that they have the appropriate resources, should they need some additional conversation. We always have counseling resources. So for our Manitoba folks, on our website, we always have up-to-date counseling resources on hand, accessible ones, so ones that are free or low cost. Also, just as anyone working in the role of engagement is making sure you have variety in your day and your role, thinking about, and as a team, as team members, thinking about doing education sessions, not only on what is research and those types of things, but maybe learning mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques, or learning together different ways to work with one another, scheduling breaks and taking time out of your day to reflect and socialize, and setting realistic goals, understanding that there are going to be times where you might mess up or things might go wrong. There might be conflict where you have to set some time aside, and it's not to take personally or as a failure, but more that these are opportunities. In so many situations that we've had where conflict has arisen with teams, it actually is an opportunity to grow the relationship. And once it's been addressed and worked through, so many times the relationship has gotten better and deeper because you've been able to have those tougher conversations together. Oh, we're at questions. I feel like there are questions coming up while I was talking.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carolyn and Ogai. What a fantastic session. I've learned a lot. I appreciate the role of conflict in relationships. And I think, yeah, just preparing for it is so key because you know it's going to happen. So you might as well go into it prepared. We do have a question that popped up about 10 minutes ago, but let's roll back to that because I said we would address it. And I'm going to pose this to Carolyn. So what's the difference, can you explain, between reflexive and reflective practice for our audience? Put you on the spot.
I always use critical reflexive practice, because that's typically where we start getting into that into those deeper questions around social location and systems of power and oppression that I think are crucial in relationship building. I think reflective a lot of times can be a little less. Like, I think reflective is kind of this ongoing practice that you have to incorporate into your daily, whereas reflective, I always feel, is kind of like a one-off, like reflecting on things, but not that committed practice of ongoing, kind of continuously looking at how things affect the way you view the world.
Like Carly shared some definitions from Google in the chat.
Ooh.
I'll just note, I'm reading it back to myself over and over, and it looks pretty close. I think there's a slight semantic difference in what I found on Google.
Oh, look at that. Thank you, Carly.
And I was just going to add to Carolyn, like when I think about reflexivity, is very much about kind of deconstructing yourself. What is your social location, your gender, and how does that fit in to our broader social, political world, and how does that impact our stance point? Whereas reflective would almost be kind of becoming self-aware of your thoughts, your emotions, but they are a perfect combination of both. So you need both. You can't have one without the other. So that's what I kind of always think about, is one is emotions and thought process, where the other one's like you yourself into this bigger system, political and everything else.
That matches the Google definition. So
It's awesome job. Okay, I was stumbling.
should have asked Ogai.
No, because I'm like thinking of what Carolyn was saying. I'm like, yes. So
that's why we're a team. I have another question from Anna. How would you define the line between disagreement and conflict? Could you give tips on how to not cross that line? Thanks. I don't feel like they are different, but maybe Anna, you're free to unmute if you want to clarify a bit.
Oh, thank you. It was just that the first presenter was saying that when disagreement leads to conflict, so where's that step in how we take care to not cross that step, not cross that line? Because everyone has disagreements, but it does not necessarily lead to a conflict, right? So
right, yeah.
What do you think, Ogai? Or do you?
That's a good question. We can, I guess it depends on the context of the disagreement and in what way, because we could have disagreements on the flavor of our coffee and then laugh about it and walk away, where sometimes disagreements can be a little bit further, which can then cross the boundary into conflict, because conflicts are disagreements. So for me, I think it could go both ways. I view some disagreements as part of conflict.
I think
Yeah.
Carrie has mentioned that disagreements is not agreeing, but conflict is when that disagreement becomes a problem.
Right.
Perhaps that's one way to define it.
Could you say, I'm wondering, oh God, like, could you say that disagreement can occur and you can address it, but then when it moves into conflict, it's kind of emotions are starting to get piled in it because it's not being addressed, and that it starts growing a little bit.
Because the emotions and the needs underneath, yeah.
Yeah, but
So
the
it
unmet
could
needs.
start with a disagreement that could turn into conflict.
Conflict. Thomas says conflict is egos.
Ooh, that's
He's onto something there. So how do we avoid, or do we avoid crossing that line? What do we do about, disagreement versus conflict? And
I wonder, like, a lot of times say, I think it's important when we're doing research, so research decision making, that we put into place participatory approaches that that can handle that can handle when people disagree on things, and how we're going to address when we're trying to make a decision and people are disagreeing. What are we going to do in order to move with that? I think so incorporating good participatory approaches to how we're going to make decisions at every phase and stage of the research process is super important, because that can address when we do disagree on things and how we're going to make our decisions. And if we don't do that, then it could start leading into conflict, because it feels like one person's perspective or values are being respected and others are not. And so then
it sounds like it's really about making sure everyone feels heard and their perspectives are valued when you're in a disagreement, right? So
yeah.
using some of that language.
And sometimes
around conflict.
compromising also is important, understanding that we will try to negotiate, mediate, and meet everyone's needs. But at times, a group decision might be that it might not meet everyone's needs, and that's okay, but we need to have talks. And even when we do our icebreakers at the beginning, we try to encourage where folks think about, why do we look at the same picture, but we're coming up with different solutions or ideas? Because again, we're coming from different perspectives, we'll have different ideas. And part of that, maybe we're gonna disagree on things, and that's okay, but having space where people can talk about why it's important to them, attentively listening and coming to a consensus as a group. Because at the end of the day, it has to be where all group members' needs are being met as much as possible, but we can make everyone happy. And again, that could lead to conflict where that person needs are not being met. But using that solution-focused, strength-based approach of, let's sit down, let's talk about this. How can we come up with a solution that also will make you feel okay at the end of the day, if we are moving with something different?
And building those guiding principles too, right? That addresses that we're going to be looking at things differently, and what does it take to make sure that we feel safe enough to disagree.
Caroline, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this. Hi, Carolyn. I love this. I'm so glad to participate today. And I love that you guys have so many resources to this end. I'm going to make a quick comment on what was just discussed, and then I have a quick question. I think disagreement is necessary. Actually, I think if like the reason we do engagement and the reason we bring patients around the table is because we know there's things that they're going to disagree with. We know that persons with lived experience are going to bring the perspectives of where things didn't go well. And so there's naturally things that will be disagreed on, which is actually necessary. I think conflict comes in then when that becomes a barrier to the relationship. I think that's like where it actually becomes a barrier to moving forward, a barrier to moving towards a common goal, a barrier towards actually like coming to some sort of agreement that can actually make things move forward, or an understanding. I don't even know if you have to agree, you just have to understand. So I think that's really interesting to explore that. what I find interesting about this discussion, and I'm curious to have your opinion on it. I think, again, I love these webinars, but I do find we tend to be around a group which is sort of a bit preaching to the choir. We're all individuals who I think try to be very conscious about our humanistic aspects in the work that we do. And therefore we're very conscious both of our own necessity to self-care, our ability to create environments that are safe, secure, but where we find ourselves as engagement experts tending to be in environments where like the others around the table are, and that we are put in a position often to help notably our patient partners, but also the others in our team to navigate environments by which that environment is not a given, and where so-called these conflicts, but also just like these natural tensions, because they're based on existing power dynamics and inequality and biases that exist are already omnipresent, but by which if we don't engage and we wait for that environment to be secure, we're basically kind of also not doing our job, because our job is to open those spaces and open those environments so that we can bring those perspectives in. So I'm just wondering, what are your recommendations to those of us that are seeing this? And I think we all have examples of how we've brought and we've accompanied our patient partners into certain environments where, we knew it wasn't always going to be so necessarily so pleasant for them. How would you encourage us to not only help obviously ourselves and the patient partners that we're accompanying, but also like, other than recommending that they watch your webinar, like what would be other recommendations for you to address this with like these larger researchers? And then again, I love my researcher colleagues, but like getting them right off the bat when they're starting a patient partnership activity to think about self-care and compassion, I'm just not sure that that's going to go off so well in a first meeting. And so I'm just putting it out there, but what would be your recommendation or your experiences to that end?
That's an amazing, great question. I think it's interesting. I think we've had times where we've had kind of mixed stakeholder groups and people who have never been around, like, so researchers and healthcare professionals who haven't necessarily gone through critical reflexive practice and those types of things. And we've done actual additional training sessions individually with people in the past. The workbook, I think, is a great thing because you can individually take it away at least and kind of encourage researchers to reflect before coming to a meeting and think about those types of things. And just, integrating those conversations. I know there's been times where we'll encourage, in our first meeting to do a lot of the relationship building, and it'll become a disagreement where people are like, no, we got to get into the research project. We don't have time to talk about safe spaces. And a lot of it's just kind of advocating that these are important aspects down the road, and to lay that foundation for good partnership and for that good process to keep on going. You really need to do some of this work ahead of time in order to create those spaces. Oh, Guy, I saw you.
Yes, it reminds me of the closing activities. So we really try to integrate some activities within our facilitation that helps people start thinking about self-care. And so we close our activities with one nice thing you will do about yourself. And so we'll go around the table, and it really helps the researcher to also think about what is one nice thing they're going to do for themselves as part of the whole self-care. So those are some things that we try to find activities that we can incorporate, but being transparent and having conversations and meeting people where they're at. So if a researcher does not want to talk about self-care in that moment, well, that's okay. When they're ready, or if we notice that a conflict arises, which it can and it will, this is not going to be something new for a researcher. They're human beings with personal relationships, professional relationships, whom I'm sure have had conflict in the past. But again, looking back at the strength-based approach of what skill sets did they use and what resources did they have in the environment, and again, having faith in our researchers that they too will take kind of the steps and necessary to be able to make those changes and what we can do what we can on our parts. But yeah, some resources that I think about are just incorporating activities that kind of gets everyone to talk about it and normalizing that for folks right from the get-go, and setting expectations as a team before even going through that whole thing. Is that sitting down, what is your expectation? This is our expectations. How do we kind of bridge that and bring it together?
We also do a lot more debriefing with researchers as well, right? So to figure it, like, just to understand how they're feeling about things that are right, and having those conversations and kind of making it a priority with researchers as well, not just patient partners, but debriefing and kind of modeling compassion as well, as to kind of bring that to them too.
Thank you, everyone. I see we're at the top of the hour. We're running a little bit late. Thanks, everyone, for attending. I just want to quickly invite you to our next session on April 12th, where the Patient and Family Engagement team from Shared Health Manitoba will share their experiences in developing a network of patient and family advisors. I'll send the links and everything to everyone who registered. Thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful day, and take these lessons learned with you, and feel free to share with us what you've learned. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Okay.
Mhm.